Today, we're looking at an incredible, almost unbelievable historical transformation. I mean, how exactly did a private trading company, the British East India Company, manage to build a massive, complex, bureaucratic state machine that dominated the Indian subcontinent for over 150 years? Well, we're going to examine the exact blueprints of this colonial architecture. We'll break down the constitutional, administrative, judicial, and even the underlying military and police developments that constructed and eventually dismantled the British Raj.
Okay, let's dive right into our roadmap for today. 1. Regulating the company. 2. The Crown takes control. 3. The civil service steel frame. 4. Constructing the judiciary. And 5. Reshaping administration.
Starting with Section 1, Regulating the Company. How the British Parliament tamed the East India Company from 1773 to 1853. For a long time, the East India Company operated with enormous autonomy, heavily focused on profits. But as they conquered more territory, the British government realized, hey, we really need some oversight here. So the British Parliament systematically stripped the company of its commercial privileges while centralizing its political power. It all starts in 1773 with the Regulating Act, which initiated a centralized administration in Bengal. By 1784, Pitt's India Act basically turns the company into a subordinate department of the British state through a board of control. We also see tweaks like the Act of 1786 giving the Governor-General override powers, and the 1793 Charter Act renewing the company's privileges. Then, by 1813, they lose their general trade monopoly. But 1833, that is the absolute peak of centralization. The Governor-General of India is given complete control over all civil and military affairs. Finally, in 1853, the company even loses its power of patronage, meaning they could no longer just hand out lucrative jobs to their buddies.
Then, everything changes. The devastating revolt of 1857 absolutely exposed the limitations of the East India Company. So, in 1858, the whole pretense of company rule was finally and completely abolished. We moved straight from a dual system of directors and boards to direct crown rule. A brand new position, the Secretary of State for India, who is actually a member of the British cabinet, takes the absolute reins over in London. Meanwhile, the Governor-General back in India gets a major title upgrade to Viceroy, acting as the direct, literal representative of the British monarch.
Moving on to Section 2. The Crown takes control. We'll look at their reluctant concessions and the path to 1935. So, the Crown's strategy was essentially a massive balancing act. They wanted to retain absolute power, sure, but they also needed to provide just enough of a representative illusion to prevent another revolt. In 1861, they introduced a portfolio system, which was essentially assigning specific government departments to individual members, and they allowed some elite, non-official Indians into legislative councils, though, frankly, they had zero real power. By 1892, mostly thanks to pressure from the early Indian National Congress, those councils were expanded and Indians could finally actually discuss the budget, but 1909 is a huge critical moment with the Morley-Minto reforms. While they did introduce an elective principle, the British explicitly established separate electorates for Muslims. This was a highly consequential strategy that injected religious division directly into the constitutional framework. That brings us through the 1919 Montfort reforms, the subsequent controversies of the Simon Commission in the late 1920s, and all the way up to the monumental 1935 Act.
Now, you absolutely need to understand what happened in 1919 with this concept called diarchy. Diarchy literally translates to the rule of two. The British essentially split provincial government right down the middle. They kept the crucial, powerful, reserved subjects, things like law, order, and finance, firmly clamped in the hands of the British governor and his bureaucrats. But they handed over the transferred subjects, like health, local government, and education, to Indian ministers who were responsible to the legislature. It was an incredibly complex system. And honestly, it was designed to look like a massive leap in self-governance, all while ensuring the real, consequential levers of power never actually left British hands.
Eventually, we get to the Government of India Act 1935, which was just massive in its legislative bulk. It finally abolished that clumsy diarchy system in the provinces, replacing it with provincial autonomy. It also proposed a really complex all-India federation, connecting British provinces with princely states, which, side note, actually never materialized due to widespread opposition. But here's the real kicker, the so what of it all. Despite its rigid, heavily safeguarded imperial nature, this exact piece of legislation ultimately became the structural blueprint for the modern constitution of independent India.
Section 3. The Civil Service Steel Frame and the Evolution of the Bureaucracy. Now, the civil service was explicitly designed as an exclusive club to serve British interests.
Early on, Lord Cornwallis systematically Europeanized the entire administration. By 1793, all high-paying posts were legally reserved for British covenanted servants, meaning those higher-level officials under direct contract with the company. And even when the 1853 Charter Act theoretically opened up recruitment to a competitive exam, the system was completely rigged. I mean, the 1861 Act ensured the exams were held in London, strictly in English, and tested subjects like classical Greek and Latin. It was a massive, almost impossible hurdle. It literally took decades of relentless demands from Indian nationalists, which led to the Aitchison Committee and later the Lee Commission in 1924, to slowly, gradually indigenize the very bureaucracy that was running the country.
On to Section 4, constructing the judiciary and building a completely new legal framework.
The British didn't just bring administrators over, they systematically dismantled local, traditional legal customs to build a formalized, highly hierarchical judicial system that served their own imperial needs. Lord Cornwallis meticulously separated this judicial hierarchy. Let's look at the base, the Munsif's Court. This is where Indian officers were actually allowed to preside, but only over minor, low-value cases. The second you step up just one rung to the registrar's court and absolutely at the district court level, boom, you hit a European judge. Cornwallis deliberately placed European judges at every single critical bottleneck of judicial power. This ensured that while the masses might interact with Indian officials at the very bottom, all consequential legal authority flowed directly upwards through European hands, all the way across the world to the King in Council in London.
But the structure is only half the story, right? The actual substance of the law changed dramatically too. Under Governor General William Bentinck's reforms, Persian was officially replaced by English in the higher courts. On top of that, a law commission headed by Lord Macaulay was set up to literally codify Indian laws, eventually resulting in the Civil and Criminal Procedure Codes and the Indian Penal Code. The so what factor here is huge. The shift to English and Macaulay's rigid codification permanently altered the linguistic and legal DNA of the entire subcontinent. It formalized a system of law that was distinctly Western in its orientation, overriding centuries of localized, flexible legal traditions.
Finally, Section 5, Reshaping Administration, looking at central, provincial, and local control post-1857.
After 1858, power flowed strictly downward. At the very top, you've got the Secretary of State in London holding ultimate authority. They feed directives down to the Viceroy in India, who executes policies centrally. Below them are the provincial governors handling the regional day-to-day issues. Now, to save the central government money, the British reluctantly delegated local sanitation, health, and basic education down to municipalities and district boards. So yeah, it was decentralization, but only for the absolute most menial of state functions, and it was heavily supervised from above. And it's really important to remember that this entire civil hierarchy was fiercely protected by a reorganized British-dominated military and a newly formalized police system, ensuring ultimate imperial control.
Which brings us to a really fascinating conclusion to ponder. The British administrative machine, the Acts of Parliament, the exclusive civil service, the codified judiciary, the centralized geographic administration, all of it was explicitly designed for imperial control and economic extraction. There was absolutely zero intent to create a democracy. Yet in this wild twist of historical irony, when India awoke to life and freedom, it didn't burn this machinery down. This very apparatus provided the functional blueprint for the modern, independent Indian state. It's a complex, double-edged legacy of colonial administration that literally continues to shape a billion lives today. Think about that as you review these concepts.